The air inside the Chicago criminal court felt suffocating, thick with anticipation. The heavy scent of old wood and paperwork clung to the walls, mingling with the faint whispers of those seated in the gallery. Rows of spectators filled the room, their murmurs creating an undercurrent of tension. Some had come for entertainment, eager to see the downfall of yet another young defendant. Others were merely passing time, their eyes flickering between their phones and the imposing judge's bench. At the defendant's table stood Lucas Carter, a 21-year-old accused of car theft and resisting arrest. His hands remained casually tucked in his pockets, a picture of defiance and control. He didn't shuffle his feet or glance nervously at the jury. His posture was unshaken, his expression unreadable. To most in the courtroom, he was just another statistic, another troubled youth who had made a bad decision. The system had seen his kind before, and in their eyes, it would see him again. Judge Arthur Delacroix sat behind the towering bench, his presence looming over the courtroom like an immovable force. A veteran of the judicial system, he had presided over countless cases, seen young men stand before him with the same tired expressions. Some begged, some wept, some lashed out in frustration. None had ever surprised him. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses as he studied Lucas with mild amusement, his lips curving into a knowing smirk. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Judge Delacroix mused, his voice laced with condescension. His words echoed in the silent courtroom, reaching every ear. "This isn't a college debate, son. This is real life." A ripple of chuckles followed, breaking the stillness. The bailiff cracked a smile, the stenographer smirked, and even the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Mark Holloway, let out a short, amused breath. The sound was a verdict in itself. This case was already decided in their minds. Everyone seemed to think this would be over quickly. Everyone except Lucas. Because Lucas had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact moment, of course, but for the battlefield of the courtroom. While other kids memorized basketball stats and debated sports teams, Lucas memorized legal precedents and debated constitutional law. While his friends played video games, immersing themselves in fantasy worlds, he devoured law books, losing himself in the intricate dance of arguments and counterarguments. He had never planned for his first case to be his own. Yet here he was, and the knowledge he carried, the very knowledge that had made him an outcast among his peers, the knowledge that had earned him odd looks at school, the knowledge that had kept him up at night, was about to change everything. He let the judge's words linger in the air, absorbing the weight of them, feeling the collective amusement of the room pressing against him. He could hear the scorn in their laughter, the certainty in their eyes that he was just another overconfident kid who didn't know how the world really worked. They thought they knew him. They didn't. Lucas finally exhaled, tilting his head slightly as he studied the people around him. The jury, the spectators, the prosecution. He saw them, but more importantly, he saw the flaws in their assumptions. He saw how easy it was for them to believe he was guilty, how effortlessly they had dismissed him. That was their first mistake. Because what they didn't know was that this case, the one they thought would be a quick and effortless conviction, was built on fragile ground. And he was about to dismantle it, one fact at a time. Judge Delacroix tapped his gavel once, silencing the murmurs that had begun to build again. He turned his attention back to the prosecution. "Proceed," he ordered, though his smirk hadn't faded entirely. Assistant District Attorney Mark Holloway straightened his tie, stepping forward with the confidence of a man who had won more cases than he had lost. His voice carried the polish of experience, smooth and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this is not a complicated case. The evidence is overwhelming." Lucas remained still. Holloway continued. "The defendant, Lucas Carter, was caught behind the wheel of a stolen 2021 BMW X5, fleeing from officers. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. This isn't speculation. This is fact. There is no doubt. He stole that car." The judge nodded slightly, as if he already agreed. "Seems straightforward to me," he commented. And yet, Lucas knew better. The prosecution was confident, but confidence didn't equal truth. And as he listened to Holloway, Lucas felt the pieces aligning in his mind. The cracks in the argument, the inconsistencies in the testimony, the single overlooked detail that would unravel everything. This wasn't the first time the system had made assumptions about someone like him, but it would be the first time they were proven wrong. And this time, he was ready. Assistant District Attorney Mark Holloway approached the jury with rehearsed confidence, his every movement exuding the ease of a seasoned prosecutor. His tailored suit, a crisp navy blue, fit him perfectly, and his polished black shoes reflected the harsh courtroom lighting. He was the embodiment of authority and experience, a man who had spent years refining his craft, shaping arguments like a sculptor chiseling stone. Every word he spoke was deliberate, every pause calculated. He stopped in front of the jury, clasping his hands in a way that suggested both control and sincerity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, persuasive. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming." He let the words hang for a moment, allowing them to settle into the minds of the jurors. His eyes swept across the courtroom, making brief yet pointed eye contact with each juror, as if silently securing their agreement before he even continued. He took a measured step forward. Lucas Carter was caught in a stolen vehicle, a 2021 BMW X5, fleeing from officers, he stated, his tone shifting slightly, emphasizing each fact as if stacking bricks on an already solid foundation. Not only that, but his fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the prosecution's table, where a neatly arranged stack of evidence sat waiting. The forensic report, the officer's testimony, the crime scene photos, each piece methodically prepared, each detail reinforcing the narrative he had constructed. "There's no doubt," he continued, his voice firm, unwavering. "He stole that car." He let the final statement land with weight, stepping back slightly as if the case had already been won. From the gallery, a murmur of quiet agreement rippled through the spectators. The judge nodded in approval, tapping his fingers lightly against the bench. "Seems straightforward to me," he remarked, his tone carrying a hint of finality. But Lucas knew better. He remained still, his expression unreadable. He had heard the same argument dozens of times before, in different words, from different voices. Prosecutors always spoke with the certainty of men who had never been questioned, never been forced to see the cracks beneath their carefully constructed cases. And this case had cracks, deep ones. Lucas just had to make them visible. His court-appointed lawyer, Allison McBride, nervously rose to speak. She was young, fresh out of law school, and though competent, she lacked the experience to handle a case that was already being stacked against them. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edges of her legal pad, her lips parting as she prepared to address the court. But before she could, Lucas gently placed a hand on her arm and shook his head. His touch was light, but the message was firm. This was his moment. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," he said. A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Delacroix, who had just been leaning back in amusement moments before, now sat up a little straighter. His gaze sharpened, scrutinizing Lucas with renewed interest. His silver-rimmed glasses slipped slightly down the bridge of his nose, and he adjusted them slowly, as if making sure he had heard correctly. "You'll what?" The judge's voice was laced with disbelief. Lucas stepped forward, his voice steady, his posture unshaken. "I'll be defending myself." For a moment, there was silence, brief, but electric. Then, like a ripple across still water, murmurs spread through the courtroom. Spectators exchanged glances, their hushed voices carrying notes of both skepticism and intrigue. Near the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Mark Holloway smirked, shaking his head as if this was just another foolish stunt by an overconfident defendant. The bailiff let out a short exhale, somewhere between a scoff and a chuckle. Even Judge Delacroix, who had seen many absurd things in his decades on the bench, allowed himself a dry chuckle. "Son," the judge said, his voice filled with condescension, "I don't think you understand what you're doing. This isn't a school project. This is a courtroom." Lucas met his gaze evenly. "I understand exactly where I am, Your Honor." The murmurs grew louder. In the back of the courtroom, someone stifled a laugh. The idea was absurd, after all. A 21-year-old, accused of grand theft auto, rejecting legal representation to go toe-to-toe with a seasoned prosecutor? It was unheard of. Holloway crossed his arms, amused. "By all means, let him try," he said, his voice carrying a note of arrogance. "This will be over before lunch." Lucas didn't react to the remark. He had expected this. He had counted on it. The moment people underestimated him was the moment they stopped preparing for what was coming. Judge Delacroix sighed. rubbing his temples before glancing at Allison McBride. "Counselor, are you certain your client is making this decision with full understanding of the consequences?" McBride hesitated. For a second, it looked like she might protest, might try to convince Lucas to reconsider. But when she turned to him, his expression was resolute. He wasn't some desperate kid grasping at straws. He was in control. She swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge studied Lucas for a long moment before exhaling. "Very well," he said, leaning back once more. "The court will allow it." More murmurs. A few people shook their heads. But Lucas didn't care. Because within minutes, the laughter stopped. Assistant District Attorney Mark Holloway stood with confidence, believing his case was airtight. He had structured his argument around a key witness, Officer Jeremy Sanders, whose testimony placed Lucas Carter behind the wheel of the stolen BMW. It was a damning statement, one that painted Lucas as a criminal caught in the act. Lucas took a slow, deep breath before turning toward the judge. His heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss Officer Sanders' testimony," he said. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Delacroix arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "On what grounds?" he asked, his tone carrying a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Lucas squared his shoulders, his gaze unwavering. "Because Sanders was never there." For a brief moment, the courtroom was silent. Then, the whispers began. Holloway stiffened, his smirk faltering for the first time. The bailiff shifted slightly, suddenly more alert. Even Judge Delacroix, a man who had heard countless defenses in his career, frowned, leaning forward in his chair. Lucas reached for a file on the defense table, lifting a printed document for everyone to see. "I obtained GPS logs from Officer Sanders' patrol vehicle," he explained, his voice crisp and clear. "And those records prove that Sanders was never at the scene. In fact, he wasn't even on duty at the time of the arrest." Gasps rippled through the room. Holloway hesitated, a fraction too long. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, Judge Delacroix noticed. The weight of the revelation settled like a stone in the pit of Holloway's stomach. His foundation had cracked, and Lucas wasn't done yet. Desperate to regain control, Holloway adjusted his tie and shot back, but Lucas' fingerprints were found on the stolen car. He said it with force, as if sheer volume could erase the doubt creeping into the courtroom. Lucas turned to the jury, his expression thoughtful. He needed them to understand, not just hear his words, but truly think. "Let's examine that logically," he said, his voice calm and composed. He paused, giving them time to shift their attention to him completely. "Imagine you walk into a store and try on a pair of sunglasses. You decide not to buy them, so you put them back. A few hours later, someone else walks in and steals those sunglasses." He scanned the jurors' faces, letting the analogy sink in before delivering the punchline. "Does that mean you're the thief?" A flicker of recognition crossed their faces. A few exchanged glances. One man in the back nodded ever so slightly. Lucas continued, pressing the advantage. "The prosecution is arguing that because my fingerprints were on the steering wheel, that proves I stole the car. But they haven't provided any evidence that I was the one who drove it away. For all we know, I could have touched the car earlier that day, or even before it was stolen." Holloway's jaw tightened. The jury was listening. And more importantly, they were questioning. Lucas wasn't finished. He reached for another document. This one even more critical than the last. The courtroom had already begun shifting. The prosecution's confidence had fractured, and Lucas was about to deliver the final blow. He lifted the paper high enough for everyone to see. "This," he announced, "is the original statement from the car's owner, David Whitmore." A flicker of confusion crossed Holloway's face before he quickly masked it. Lucas pressed on. "The prosecution conveniently left this out of their case, but it's right here. Mr. Whitmore told the police he saw the person who stole his car. He gave a description. And guess what?" Lucas' voice dropped slightly, letting the tension thicken. He was white. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, murmurs, shifting in seats. The energy in the courtroom had completely changed. People who had assumed Lucas was guilty now looked at him differently. They looked at Holloway differently. They looked at the system differently. Lucas locked eyes with Holloway. His expression wasn't cocky, but firm, determined. And yet, someone who doesn't even match the description, was the one arrested. The room was silent now, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were thinking. Lucas had done what seemed impossible. He had taken an open-and-shut case and cracked it wide open. Judge Delacroix leaned forward, gripping his gavel with both hands. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, the tension palpable. He studied Lucas for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching for something beyond the young man's composed exterior. Was it arrogance? Foolish luck? Or was it something more? Something the judge rarely saw in his courtroom? Lucas stood motionless, his face unreadable, waiting. He had made his case. He had exposed the holes in the prosecution's argument, dismantled the so-called evidence piece by piece, and forced everyone in the room to rethink their assumptions. He knew that the decision had already been made, but he waited, letting the weight of silence stretch just a second longer. Finally, Judge Delacroix exhaled. His grip on the gavel loosened slightly before he straightened his posture and let out a low, measured breath. His voice, when he spoke, carried a finality that left no room for argument. Case dismissed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, chaos. The silence shattered as the courtroom erupted in movement. A woman in the gallery sighed audibly, pressing a hand to her chest in relief. A few voices rose in murmurs of disbelief. Others whispered hurriedly, their words lost beneath the noise. Even the bailiff, normally a pillar of stoicism, raised an eyebrow in surprise. At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Mark Holloway's expression darkened. His jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he swiftly began packing up his documents. He didn't look at Lucas. He didn't need to. The case had collapsed, and he knew it. Lucas, however, remained still. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smirk. He simply stood there, letting the moment settle, letting the room absorb the truth that had just unraveled before them. He had walked into this courtroom labeled a criminal, a lost cause, another name in the system. He had walked out something else entirely. Judge Delacroix continued to watch him, his eyes narrowing slightly. The amusement he had once held, the condescension that had laced his earlier words, was gone. There was something new in his expression, not defeat, not frustration, but something closer to respect. Lucas turned, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the exit. The whispers continued behind him, the weight of his victory trailing in his wake. The moment felt surreal, yet at the same time, it felt inevitable. He had always known the truth. He had simply needed the courtroom to see it, too. Just as he reached the door, a firm voice called out, "Mr. Carter." Lucas stopped. He didn't turn around, but he listened. Judge Delacroix rested his hands on the bench, studying the young man before him. There was a pause, a moment where words seemed to hang in the air before finally being spoken. "You should consider law school," the judge said, his voice softer this time, carrying none of the arrogance from before. For the first time that day, a small smirk flickered across Lucas' lips. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. As Lucas stepped outside, the cold Chicago air hit his face, crisp and biting. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. He barely had a moment to breathe before the media descended on him like a wave. Reporters shoving microphones forward, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of questions. "Lucas, how does it feel to win your own case? Were you always planning to defend yourself? What do you say to those who still believe you're guilty? Do you think this case proves systemic bias in the justice system?" He heard them. He could have answered. He could have taken this moment to bask in the victory, to break down every flaw in the prosecution's case for the cameras, to revel in the fact that he had just outmaneuvered a seasoned prosecutor and a skeptical judge. But he didn't, because this wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about proving how often the system gets it wrong. Lucas took a slow breath, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. Some were just there for the headline, the sensational story of a young man who had beaten the odds. But others were watching with something deeper in their eyes. A quiet understanding, a silent recognition. For every Lucas Carter, there were countless others, people who didn't have the knowledge to fight back, people who never got the chance to challenge the evidence against them. Some had been pressured into plea deals, too afraid to risk harsher sentences. Others had been convicted on faulty evidence, their voices drowned out by a system that moved too fast to care. How many of them had sat in courtrooms just like his, watching helplessly as their fate was decided? How many had been accused, not because they were guilty, but because they were easy targets? This story wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. Because next time, it might not be Lucas. It might be someone you know.